Well, tonight you're going to hear how the European nations them carve up Africa and who take what and who take what. You know, there's a book named How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney, a very important book to read. Tonight you're going to hear all the people them who was responsible for carving up this great continent. The tape is called Africa Cake. It's a piece of the cake, and them go on like this piece of cake really. Because when them sit down around them table and them discuss it, without the people them in mind who own the land. And tonight you're going to hear some serious statements by some serious European leaders about how they decide to carve up Africa. We're going to carry it to school tonight. Cutting edge, I refer. Not only the land, but the people. The different nations, the different European nations that went into Africa. The Germans, Belgium, French, English. And this tape, you're going to hear so much things that cause us to reach to this stage of underdevelopment. When you hear man talk about Africa underdeveloped, you will see tonight and you will hear tonight the reason why Africa is underdeveloped. And we have to put all blame at the feet of the European invaders. So I want, say, we want you to listen to this tape here. It's a very important tape, so you will realize why Muta behave certain way certain times. You understand? It's after knowing these things, you can't help but really think and react certain way. Okay, as we said before, we want to present to you a tape here. It's really the cake, the African cake, the tape called the African cake. And it's all about how Europe really cut up Africa for themselves without even the people's interests. Then they were taking into consideration that people was there, as a matter of fact. On the tape you will hear how they describe African people. A very serious documentary. We want you to know that it's a very important thing. Alright. It's a tape, as I said before, how Europe underdeveloped Africa and how the Europeans saw it fit to leave for them country. Because everywhere Europeans have been to, they have devastated the land and the people. Everywhere. There's nowhere that Europeans have been to and they make the country be like what they came inside. They have tried to Christianize the people. They have tried to bring their own form of government, cultures, ideas, and thoughts. So we have grown up to believe that there is nothing outside of European thoughts and European philosophy. Because every time we define ourselves, we define it through the eyes of European standard. And whenever we try to come out of that mold, people see you as crazy or as escapists. Because all of our values and moralities and ethics is defined by white people. You understand? And it would appear and make me feel like we as African people, or even people in India, it makes it come like, say, these people culture is of no value. And the irony about it is that these cultures existed thousands of years before Europe existed. So there must have been something that was generating morality, spirituality, economic development and progress before Europeans came along. Because these people was and were surviving without the help of European invaders. They were surviving, and when I say surviving, I mean nearer to nature, more calm in spirit, more in tune with life. And when the Europeans came, all of that changed. And now we grow up in societies that make us believe that the only true value of life is through the eyes of Europeans. Well, we come to break that mold on the cutting edge. And this is all a part of the education. So when we finish playing these advertisements, start a tape rolling. Cutting edge IRFM.
west coast of Africa, looking today much as it did 100 years ago. At that time, the old evils of the slave trade had become a distant, though disgraceful, memory. But there now opened a new chapter of confrontation along these tropical shores. In past years, Europeans had come here for profitable business. Now they wanted more, much more. Old trading posts like this one had long been the scene of a partnership between maritime traders from Europe and local Africans. By the 1880s, that old partnership was being swept away in a dramatic change, the outcome of a new European drive for overseas empire. Industrialized countries led by France and Britain had begun to invade the Black Continent, each hoping for new sources of raw materials for its factories, new markets for its manufacturers, and new positions of advantage against its rivals. This was called the Scramble for Africa. By 1914, only two countries remained outside European possession, Liberia in the west and Ethiopia in the east. Britain had seized the lion's share of control. Egypt and the Sudan in the north, the immense wealth of South Africa, valuable colonies like Rhodesia and Kenya, and richly populated territories such as Nigeria and the Gold Coast. France had invaded Algeria in the 1830s. Now, after new wars of conquest, she added more colonies to her empire south of the Sahara, including the island of Madagascar. Little Portugal carved out two vast colonies, Angola and Mozambique, while Imperial Germany took Italy and Spain completed the enclosure. The fate of the continent was utterly changed. Between the colonizing powers themselves, the carve-up was peaceful, but their rivalry was intense. In 1884, a Congress of the competing governments met in Berlin to settle their disputes. Germany's Iron Chancellor Bismarck was there. And active behind the scenes was the ambitious Belgian king. He spoke for them all when he said, "I am determined to get my share of this magnificent African cake." Any power that could occupy African soil could effectively claim it. Now the task was to stake out frontiers in utterly uncharted land. Said the French Prime Minister, "We have embarked on a gigantic steeplechase into the unknown." The British Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, was to say of this period, "We've been engaged in drawing lines on maps where no man's foot has ever trod. We've been giving away mountains and rivers and lakes to each other, only hindered by the small impediment that we never knew exactly where we were." The great game was to get hold of places and positions of advantage over rivals, no matter what irrational frontiers might result. One of the most absurd cases was the magnificent Gambia River. Britain had long held Bathurst, Banjul today, and was determined to keep this river route to the interior. But France, invading from the west coast, enclosed all the territory surrounding the Gambia River in her new colony of Senegal. So the French were naturally eager to obtain the Gambia River. They offered Britain, in exchange, the much larger and richer Ivory Coast. But the British Parliament insisted on keeping the Gambia, thus dividing the peoples of the region. And the result was, and is, a country that is 300 miles long, but never more than 30 miles wide. What the African inhabitants might think of this colonial carve-up was never asked. The European idea, in the words of one British governor, was to seize African territory and then, as much as possible, rule the country as if there were no inhabitants. In fact, European contempt for Africans now reached new depths, and no wonder. For how otherwise than by asserting that Africans were helpless children, lazy savages, could Christian Europe justify taking their countries away from them? The helpless children, meanwhile, sang their own version of a famous hymn. Onward, Christian soldiers, into heathen lands, prayer books in your pockets, rifles in your hands. Take the happy tidings where trade can be done. Spread the peaceful gospel with the Gatling gun. The European invasions were widely resisted. Conquest was never easy. And sometimes, as these old drawings and photographs testify, conquest led to a ruthless killing that later generations would prefer to forget. Resistance took many shapes. In French West Africa, a focal point was found in Muslim loyalties. Many heroes, still unforgotten, came on that scene. Some, like the Senegalese religious leader Ahmadou Bamba, offered the way of peace, but were still sent into exile. Others, like the fierce warrior leader Samori, fought off French attack after attack, and was crushed and exiled only after years of war. Death took many, strong or weak. With the skulls of earlier wars displayed in their capital, Kumasi, the powerful Ashanti nation ruled over most of modern Ghana. Led by their kings, who had the title of Asantehene, they'd long defended their country against Britain, but now they desperately wanted a peaceful settlement. In 1895, fearing a disastrous war with Britain, King Prempeh made a strong bid for peace from his palace here at Kumasi. He offered the British the right to establish in Ashanti a chartered company with all the concessions, the privilege that such a company could possibly desire. But it wasn't enough, for the British now wanted territorial possession as well as privilege. The Ashanti nation had already fought long, hard battles against the British. But this time, in 1896, they decided to surrender. In a ceremony of deliberate humiliation, the king was made to kiss the British commander's boot and then sent into exile. But it wasn't the end of the story. The British now blundered. A new British governor, Sir Frederick Hodgson, decided that he had to get possession of the sacred golden stool, symbol of the Ashanti nation's soul. Arriving at the British fort here in Kumasi, he ordered the assembled chiefs to hand the stool over. Worse still, he demanded the right to sit on it, something that no person had ever been allowed to do, not even the king himself. To Hodgson's final insult, the Ashanti replied with war. This little fort in Kumasi is what the British had built, just in case, and now they sorely needed it. The few dozen British inmates of the fort were besieged for months and had to eat rats to stay alive. Hodgson's act of folly had exacted a bitter price. Efforts to send in relief from the coast were repeatedly frustrated by Ashanti resistance. Until finally, the governor and his wife got away to the coast, and the absurd but tragic affair could be closed. This ended war between Britain and Ashanti, and a year later, in 1901, the British quietly annexed the country, which became part of the colony of the Gold Coast. All over Africa, the new military technology of automatic guns gave easy victories to the invaders. Countless resistors died. Many thousands at the single battle of Omdurman in Britain's conquest of the Sudan. Meanwhile, in another part of the Sudan, the French were scoring victories. For the most part, public opinion rejoiced. For were these not victories over an inferior species, a kind of joke humanity? There were some critics, but not many, and their voice was ignored or silenced. What really mattered was to do down one's European rivals. If you were British, to get the better of the French in West Africa or the Germans in East Africa. While orphans, like little Uganda, were left on the protective doorstep of Father John Bull. Even before 1900, there came a new source of conflict. Settlers from Europe, French in the far north, Dutch and then British in the far south, and some Germans. Other settlers were attracted to the good farming land of the east, to Tanganyika, northern and southern Rhodesia, and the British territories of Uganda and Kenya. Once again, nobody asked permission. An early French governor had laid down the golden rule. Wherever good water and fertile land are found, he said, settlers must be installed without questioning whose land it may be. The settlers, not surprisingly, agreed. The next step in East Africa was to build a railway from the coast to the interior. The line was completed in 1901, and millions of acres of good farming land in Kenya were opened to white ownership and settlement for the buying price of next to nothing. These white strangers, oddly enough, were at first welcomed by the African inhabitants. But the welcome didn't last for long, for they soon discovered that colonial government wanted them to give things, above all their land and their labor. These colonial demands provoked a repeated resistance. And against that resistance, the colonial government, with white settlers arriving in ever larger numbers from Britain, waged a war with little mercy, and of course, with rifles and machine guns, against spears and arrows. This beating down of a sometimes violent and desperate African protest was called pacification, or less politely, hammering. A British officer then fighting in Kenya kept a sadly instructive diary.
Marched into Fort Hall, and the expedition comes to an end. To my mind, the people of the Embu have not been sufficiently hammered, and I should like to go back at once and have another go at them. During the first phase of our expedition against the Irieni, we killed 797 niggers, and during the second phase against the Embu, we killed about 250.
There was, in fact, much more of the same thing. In a sixth campaign against the Kenya Nandi, for example, British troops reported killing 1,117 people, besides seizing all their livestock. In 1906, a junior British minister in London cabled this protest. Surely it cannot be necessary to go on killing these defenseless people on such an enormous scale. The minister's name was Winston Churchill, but on that occasion his intervention had no effect. ya kake zaka makaindi kare kwanga mata na ko makaindi gake gwega tekane kya muzongo mara mare ko makainga to makolera kwa mimi.
By 1915, about 4 million acres of African farming land in central Kenya had been given to about 1,000 British settlers. By the 1920s, about half of the able-bodied men of Kenya's two largest farming peoples, the Kikuyu and the Luo, were working as laborers for British newcomers. How was that done? The answer, once again, was something new in Kenya: taxation. To cultivate these splendid acres, it was necessary to make Africans pay taxes in cash. Having no money economy of their own, Africans could pay tax in cash only if they went to work for a European wage. An old Maasai recalls those early days.
Sasa wazungu walipokaa sasa walianza kutawala. Walipotawala, kitu walitaka kodi. Ya Masai zamani hapana lipa kodi ya kichwa kama ile tunaita zamani poll tax. Kulikuwa nalipa na nyumba. Walikuwa naita kodi ya nyumba.
The Maasai proved particularly good at dodging the payment of the new taxes. So the colonial government thought it should send some of these apparently idle warriors to school, so as to turn them, if possible, into tax collectors among their own people. Small boys were seized for this purpose.
Sasa serikali walitoa askari yake kuja kuchukua watoto. Sasa mimi ni moja ya wale watoto ambao walisikwa kupelekwa skuli. Sasa nilisikwa nikapelekwa skuli. Sasa pamoja na wale watoto wengine.
On the other side of the continent, in northern Nigeria, the colonial scene was very different. With no white settlers, life was peaceful. Things continued much as before. The British had conquered this huge region, far from the sea, for no real reason other than to keep it from the French. So the British were content with a supervision which allowed them to take a back seat. Under the direction of Lord Lugard, this was called indirect rule. This was the residence of the British official who governed the northern Nigerian province of Kano. Indirect rule meant ruling through local kings, in this case the local emir, who after defeat accepted British overlordship. On condition that nothing was done to modernize or democratize the conquered system, indirect rule was cheap and highly effective. Local kings and princes kept the peace and law and order in their own interest, as well as in that of the British. Both sides, at the top, had much to gain. So kings, like this one, the Emir of Katsina, were able to stay in power and even add to their personal privileges. They were able to call on their own local retainers to govern the everyday affairs of the country. In this way, the native governing class, as the doctrine said, was to remain a real living force, as well as being a curious and interesting pageantry.
The ceremonies are the same as 1,000 years ago. There were kings in northern Nigeria when Richard Lionheart set out on crusade. Today, he and all the emirs of northern Nigeria play their part as subjects of the King of England. But their subjects still show their loyalty as in the days when Katsina was warring with her neighbors. Katsina still keeps her way of life, still resists new influences from the world outside.
In short, no modernization of any kind, and therefore big problems for the future. I talked to Nigerian Professor Obaro Ikeme.
For the larger part of Nigeria, British rule did not mean anything for many years. In other words, although at the center of administration, there was a change which could be seen by the people and felt by the people. In the outlying areas, life went on as if the British did not exist. If you take Lugard's own particular area, the north, for example, the seat of the emir and the seat of the district head may have felt the immediate impact of the British presence. But the villages were ordered and run just as before, with one important difference though, taxation. That the people had to pay tax to a new power. The British built up a core of Africans who became known as native administrators, developed some commitment to the system. The salaries were comfortable. They had power, which they used to enrich themselves at the expense of their followers and their subjects. Consequently, the British were able to succeed largely by developing a core of people who became partners with them.
British officers, headed by a resident, are there in every emirate to advise and assist the emir and his ministers in their day-to-day work. And each month, the resident presides at a full meeting with the emir's council. There may be words from Nigeria's governor in Lagos, or from the colonial office in London, or the council may discuss the repatriation of pilgrims from Mecca. The dignity of the plough, the traditions of Katsina are present in the council chamber.
Here, once more, this time behind polite words, was the essence of colonial paternalism. In the French colonies along the coast, the scene was both the same and different. Dakar, capital of Senegal, actually the little suburb of Rufisque, a charmingly nostalgic place. Senegal was France's oldest colony in tropical Africa, and one where the French presence, like that of the British in northern Nigeria, could easily be absorbed. Generally, the French ran their colonies on much the same system as the British, but there was one important difference.
The British thought that their Africans could never become anything but Africans, and certainly not British. The French idea, on the contrary, was that in the end, at some distant time, all their Africans would become black Frenchmen. The culture and the language of France were offered as the eventual supreme blessings. This idea was called assimilation.
Originally, this was a generous idea, but colonial rule reduced it to little or nothing. Yet in 4 municipalities of coastal Senegal, assimilation did take effect. This picturesque island of Gorée, just off the port of Dakar, was one. Here you could go to school and even become a French citizen. But you belonged to a tiny minority. By 1926, only 48,000 Senegalese had become assimilated out of a total of 1.5 million. The Senegalese historian, Professor Sheikh Anta Diop, explains.
En fait, certains, dans la pratique, ce n'était pas possible. Et dans la pratique, il y a eu 4 communes ici au Sénégal et partout ailleurs. Pratiquement, c'était le système de l'indigénat. Donc, à cause du rapport numérique, la politique d'assimilation n'était pas applicable sur le terrain.
One man from Gorée Island who did make it and carved out for himself a brilliant career was Blaise Diagne. Of humble origins, Diagne became the first black man to be elected to the French National Parliament in Paris. He campaigned for black rights and began to win concessions. That was in 1914. During the First World War, an embattled France called for tens of thousands of African troops as Flanders swallowed its victims. Blaise Diagne agreed to be France's recruiting sergeant, and his African reputation vanished in the slaughter.
xam nga renseignement moo tax ma dem xam nga ku la bëgg yóbbu ci guerre du la neex gannaaw xamuloo ko du la neex.
France had long relied on African mercenaries, even as far back as the Crimean War. But now it was different in scale and in suffering. More than 200,000 African troops, mostly conscripts, were sent to France. And at least 170,000 were thrown into the Holocaust of the trenches. Thousands never came home. Others returned with an experience that survivors have still not forgotten.
xeex nañu ak Allemagne rey nañu leen ñi la ñuy jox seen baat ñu jox suñu baat ñi la ñuy jox seen loxo ñu jox seen loxo ñi la jël di ñëw nekk gumbo ñi la jël ñëw nekk dara nekkuñu dara waaw yow suma loxo di ci la bokk benn bala ngi bëgg ni ci fii mu ngi ne benn bal mu ngi bëgg du mer mu ngi jàll fi génn ci fii mu ngi.
Shoulder to shoulder, white men and black men, equal in the trenches. Were they now to become equal in the colonies? Only the monuments suggested that.
bala ngi bëgg ni ci fii mu ngi ne benn bal mu ngi bëgg du mer mu ngi jàll fi génn ci fii mu ngi.
Shoulder to shoulder, white men and black men, equal in the trenches. Were they now to become equal in the colonies? Only the monuments suggested that. With the coming of peace in 1918, the victorious colonial systems looked more strongly entrenched than ever before, so military rule now gave way to civilian government. This led to a far more thorough system of tax collection to pay for the government. The linchpin of the British system was the district officer.
Where I come in. I'm the district officer in this particular area. The native authority treasurer sends his figures to me for checking against last year's figures. When it's decided what the tax is to be this year, I go up to tell the chiefs and people what they're to pay and why. That's my wife. I spend so much time doing the rounds that if she didn't come, we wouldn't see much of each other. We take our beds and everything else, as the rest houses where we spend the night have no furniture. You know, we are very ordinary people, but the pagans still find it a bit of a puzzle about us and father. That's the local chief. We ask you, the cops of the children. It's like sitting in a shop window. We come here every year and follow the same ritual, but they always behave as though it was the first time. Peace is all very well, but it is dull, and they love a bit of a ride.
Many colonial officials were good, practical, hard-working people devoted to their ideals. They were sure that the strong paternal arm of colonial rule must be a blessing for Africans and would have to be continued for centuries. They firmly believed that if left to themselves, Africans would simply go on living as before, and that, they thought, would be a thoroughly bad thing. An old film tells the story as the colonial officials saw it.
This simple life under the hot African sky was once a life of fear and uncertainty.
British rule has brought peace. The enterprise of European officials and settlers and of Indian traders has opened up the country. But there is still a long battle to be fought with ignorance, poverty, and disease. In these lands, where there are so many changes to be made, much can be achieved by money and the initiative of the white man.
In the more favored colonies, those were the hopes of the 1920s, and in some respects they were fulfilled. There came the founding of the first modern hospitals, veterinary services, and other benefits of Western life. But all the money to pay for these good things had to come from Africans. So they now began a drive for the export of crops to yield cash.
In these lands, where there are so many changes to be made, much can be achieved by money and the initiative of the white man.
In the more favored colonies, those were the hopes of the 1920s, and in some respects they were fulfilled. There came the founding of the first modern hospitals, veterinary services, and other benefits of Western life. But all the money to pay for these good things had to come from Africans. So they now began a drive for the export of crops to yield cash. The cash crop era got into its stride. Groundnuts appeared in Senegal, where a crop that brought cash to farmers and to colonial purchasing companies. But the cash crop's success also brought problems.
Il est certain que l'arachide a été introduit pour alimenter tout simplement la monoculture de l'arachide a été introduite pour des raisons industrielles, ni plus ni moins. C'est en 1848, je crois, que les Marseillais l'ont introduit ici pour fabriquer tout simplement de l'huile pour vendre ça sur le marché international. Et on a spécialisé finalement, la tendance est née de spécialiser chaque colonie en fonction de ce qu'elle pouvait produire le mieux. Et on a donc toutes les zones sahéliennes ont été spécialisées pour la culture de l'arachide, des zones comme la Guinée pour la culture de la banane et le riz, et ainsi de suite. Mais ça, c'était en fonction, non pas des intérêts locaux des indigènes, de ceux qui habitaient ces terres-là, mais en fonction des besoins en matière première des usines qui tournaient à Marseille, à Bordeaux et en Europe d'une façon générale.
So long as their crops were bought, African growers could be reasonably content. But in 1929 there began the huge and long disaster of the World Depression, and prices collapsed. Food production for local people, already badly hit because of land taken for cash crops, became a subject of major crisis. What was true of the French Empire was just as true of all the others. Here in the Gold Coast, the big cash crop was cocoa, providing the bulk of the colony's exports. The crop was grown and harvested entirely by African farmers who had to sell it to British and other foreign buying companies. These companies banded together so as to pay the farmers an artificially low price. The farmers of Ghana, then the Gold Coast, nonetheless worked so well that they became the world's biggest producers of cocoa, and so of chocolate, which Africans didn't eat. But the gains were far from equally shared. The Ghanaian historian, Professor Ada White.
There's no doubt at all that the farmers were being cheated. The prices that were being paid for the cocoa bore no relationship to the prices that they had to pay for the imported goods. We had no say in the pricing of our own commodities. We had no say in what we paid for what was imported. This was, in fact, one of the greatest indictments against the colonial economic policy. The fact that so much emphasis was placed on a single cash crop. And we had to import rice, we had to import oil, palm, oil and so on, in order to feed ourselves, because so much emphasis and so much attention was paid to this single cash crop cocoa. The colonial governments were just concerned with obtaining raw materials to feed their factories abroad.
The raw materials were produced by the skill and enterprise of hard-working African men and women. Yet the advertisement in Europe deeply racist by this time, presented an insultingly different picture. At the same time, African businessmen found that the trading positions they had established in earlier times were now swept away.
There's no doubt at all that before the colonial period, Africans were playing a far more important dominant role in the economy than during the colonial period. There were many of them running their own import-export business. In the 1920s and 1930s, all these African merchant princes eventually disappeared from the scene because the dikes were so much more against them as well as the colonial system. The banks were distributing against them in granting loans. The expatriate firms, and particularly the Syrian Lebanese firms, were undercutting them, and they just could not stand the challenge, and therefore many of them simply ran out of business. And the children of these great merchant princes now became the employees of the great African capitalist companies like UAC, UTC, SUA, and so on.
Colonial trading companies, British, French, Belgium, Portuguese, monopolized wholesale business with the full backing of their colonial governments. What King Muta had called this magnificent African cake was beginning to yield its riches. Often those were painful days, but they have to be recalled by anyone who wishes to understand the problems of Africa now. The turmoil of today in the Congo, or Zaire, has its roots in the infamous Congo Free State of King Leopold. Here, the emphasis was on the growing of rubber, and the methods used to extract it were no better than a reign of terror. Local people were forced to collect rubber under the most cruel conditions, as these old photographs show. If the rubber they collected was poor or small in quantity, men, and sometimes women too, could expect to lose a hand or foot in punishment. Terrible things were done. An official British fact-finding commission reported. The daily agony of an entire people unrolled itself in all its repulsive, terrifying details. Public opinion in Europe grew horrified. Gradually, the agonies were reduced. Yet huge damage had been done, moral as well as physical, and was going to cast a dark and violent shadow over the future of the Congo. Forced labor by the 1920s was practiced on a wide scale in most of the colonies. All early roads and railways were built by forced labor. Much was achieved, but the cost in life and health was sometimes catastrophic. This spectacular railway in French Equatorial Africa was built by 125,000 Africans to link the coast with Brazzaville, the inland capital. Beyond doubt, a great feat of engineering. But before a single passenger could travel on it, nearly 14,000 Africans were to die in building it. Travel in comfort came at a price. By the 1920s, the colonial railway map was complete. These lines had one central purpose: to ensure the export of minerals and other wealth, most of all from southern Africa. European mining activity for gold, copper, zinc, diamonds transformed southern Africa, thanks again to African labor acquired by the usual procedure of administrative force and taxation. Conditions were hard to bear. Some 30,000 Africans died in southern Rhodesian mines between 1904 and 1933, mostly of disease. And wages at the end of that period were lower than they'd been at the start. This labor system was called Chibaro. They old men can still remember it. Gold mining boomed. In those years at Chibaro, the Southern Rhodesian mining industry produced gold worth £87 million sterling, at the cost of 20 dead African miners each week on average for 30 years. Just as in the bigger mines of South Africa, living conditions for miners were appalling. Safety provisions were primitive. Discipline was often brutal. Healthcare almost non-existent. Prison labor was used whenever available, and that was often. And child labor too. After 1930, the whole labor system in large regions had come to depend on people having to abandon their villages and go far away to work in colonial mines or on plantations. This was called migrant labor, a huge upheaval which soon began to destroy the old stabilities of rural Africa. An official British committee in 1935 reported that the old order of society was being completely undermined by migrant labor. The years ahead were going to confirm it. But it was in the Portuguese colonies, especially Angola and Mozambique, that forced labor was at its worst. Here in Mozambique, and by brutal methods, African farmers were forced to grow cotton and to sell it at prices fixed by the colonial government. Prices kept so low that the farmers used to say of the cotton that they were forced to grow, that cotton was the mother of poverty. Raw cotton was sent to textile factories in Portugal and returned in the form of shirts for Africans to buy. All the profits were Portuguese. The more the farmers then could hate cotton, the more they were forced to grow it on pain of severe punishment.
abafamba amikini nemasimini lokhu bilegina abakhumuka abalanziwa bayatekiwa babhiwa izithilane bayamasimini na bangajanga akona wona ngikho kontekela kana bamuka kitona yako batiyala imkangato ni basi kama basi kama shaudari usarengana jealous. Something to jealous.
The farmers in this old film had no legal means of protest, but they could express their anger by singing anti-colonial songs in their own language. There seemed to them no way out, no hope ahead. And before long, the same disaster struck here as elsewhere. Food crops disappeared, and once prosperous areas were hit by famine.
Utani akunganyankama wakutira masimu aunganyankama wakubelekera masimu yagenda igara mavele nesifanekela kahakona ile zvinokwaso ikariti hasona svatisi zvavo kuti mavele nenikwaso se atinjara tikura.
In spite of African suffering, settlers arrived in growing numbers. Some were political exiles from the Portuguese dictatorship. Many were poor people hoping for a better life. Sent out to be fast preferred the easier life of the towns. They opened shops and business and aimed at the success which had eluded them at home. This actually suited the official colonial doctrine. The Portuguese dictator Marcelo Caetano laid it down in plain words. The blacks are to be organized and enclosed, he said, in an economy directed by whites.
Logo isungula kumulabula nite kadishador nitratari wakwe leswaku a governo wa Maputukeni I governo leyi nga twala misaveni hinkwayo hi vunene bya yona kambe n'wina vadimistradori mugeni governo wa Maputukezi Afrika a nga ta va kona wisa a mu landzanga a swileleto leswi mu nga tirha swona Afrika.
Mass resistance was to develop later, but already even the poorest, the least educated Africans could see that colonial rule had much more to take than to give.
Whatever good may have come from colonial rule has to be measured, unfortunately, against the essential aims of each of the colonial systems. These aims were frankly stated. They were to extract wealth. We've looked at some of the ways in which wealth was extracted, by the use of forced or cheap labor, by the seizure of land, by the insistent pressure on growing crops for export rather than crops for local food needs, and always by the deliberate treatment of Africans as inferior beings.
Whatever appearances might suggest, Africans in fact were no longer prepared to accept their permanently inferior status. All over the continent, the first signs of a new political dissent had already begun to appear. In the 1920s, for example, with the protest action of Harry Suku in Kenya. At the same time with Casely Hayford and his companions in British West Africa. And perhaps above all with Herbert Macaulay, often called the father of Nigerian nationalism. But their demands were small.
Some of these nationalists were completely taken in by the British system. They thought it was a good thing, and that we should become part of that good thing. And their real pressure was for the British to become a bit more liberal.
During the 1930s, and notably with the rise to prominence of the fiery but very effective Nigerian nationalist Nnamdi Azikiwe, much stronger and more far-reaching demands began to be made. Men like Azikiwe used the press where this was possible, as it was in British West Africa. They now sought a mass audience. Politics moved out of polite drawing rooms into the clamor of the streets.
So the resistance movement took many forms. And it was not confined only to the elite, as some people tend to say, but it was also evident in the rural areas and even among the ordinary farmers and the ordinary workers.
One form of mass resistance took shape in a big cocoa hold-up in the Gold Coast when farmers demanded fairer prices. Once again, the press could be used to good effect.
But unfortunately, in the 1950s, there was never any coordination between the protests of the rural folk and the farmers and the protests being organized by the elite. And this is why the resistance movement was not very successful.
But now, in 1935, came a new and savage challenge to African hopes of progress. Another colonial invasion. Fascist Italy's brutal assault on Ethiopia, then called Abyssinia.
No power on earth now seems able to hold out Italy's sweeping advance across Abyssinia's rain-swept mountains. Now Desce has been captured. From there, a direct road leads to Addis Ababa. So perhaps it's only a question of time as to when the victorious Italian troops will march into the capital, and the emperor will have to sue for peace.
With the colonial powers sounding quite pleased about this invasion, Italy's armies pushed on against a far weaker adversary and bombed and shelled their way to success. But Africans were outraged.
For the first time, the blacks all over the world, this time not even African, but the blacks all over the world felt that they have been attacked. You know, Ethiopia and Liberia were the only two countries in Africa that were able to maintain their sovereign existence during the period of the Scramble and the occupation of the continent by the imperial powers. And Ethiopia therefore became the symbol of hope, not only for Africa, but for all the black peoples all over. Ethiopia was looked upon as the symbol of the revival and the regaining of the independence and sovereignty of Africa. And therefore, when this invasion took place, it meant the complete snuffing out of this last beam of hope.
Italy's troops entered Addis Ababa, capital of a now subjected Ethiopia. And still there came no more than verbal protest from outside powers. Yet Ethiopia's defeat, painfully confirmed when her people laid down their arms, sent out a call for action to Africans everywhere.
Indeed, for some of us, 1935 now is being considered as a more appropriate date for the beginning of the modern nationalist period of African history, rather than 1939 or even 1945. Because we believe that, but for the breakout of the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939, probably the struggle for independence would have begun from 1935 as a result of the indignation, as a result of the anger, as a result of the emotions, as a result of the strong feelings of anti-imperialism that were aroused by the Italian invasion of Ethiopia.
Those feelings were aroused above all among the few who could win a modern education at schools like this one, at Muta in the Gold Coast, where Kwame Nkrumah, future leader of the country's independence movement, had been a student. Young people began to read whatever anti-colonial newspapers they could find. Even in the midst of discouraging years, hope flourished afresh.
A new generation of educated Africans, some of them trained here at Muta, was reaching maturity. And then came the tremendous upheavals of the Second World War, surging with revolutionary force through the entire colonial world. By 1945, as we shall see in our next program, the scene was set for great dramas in a struggle for independence.
The Cutting Edge has been a source of enlightenment and upliftment for the youth. Parents, please follow suit.
You have been listening to a tape that we present here, and the destruction and the underdevelopment of Africa by European invaders. The narrator carried you through a historical perspective of what Europeans did to Africa. Of note is the rubber thing in the Congo, where if you wasn't found worthy in terms of your rubber work, you could lose a hand or a foot. Now it's interesting to note that when Christopher Columbus came to the Caribbean here, in Jamaica too, searching for gold, they used to send out the Arawaks to find gold, and one of the punishments for not finding gold or finding enough gold was to cut off the Arawaks' hand and feet. There was a lot of Arawaks that was walking around without any wrist and without any foot. It's a serious thing. And it's the same thing happening in the Congo also. And I personally have pictures, not drawing, I have pictures of Africans in the Congo that was photographed during that time with their wrists in them right hand or them right hand in them left hand and them foot in them hand, where them cut off them foot and them have to hold them foot in them own hand. A very, very serious indictment against European civilization, you know, and the cruelty, you know, that was, you know, perpetuated on African people just to develop the wealth of Europe is really something else for really listen to. You hear the man talk about how much Africans died, 20 dead each week in Rhodesia, in the mines of Rhodesia, now called Zimbabwe. 20 deaths each week, you know? It's a really a serious thing. Yeah, there with you know, we just talk about the tape and the things that the narrators speak about, you know. The destructive nature of Europeans extend itself not only in Africa, but India, you know, in Australia, in the Caribbean. And one, if you ask the question, how come these things in history is there for us to understand, yet we still continue the mindset that devalue our culture, our understanding of life, and put at people who has proven themselves to be very barbaric in relationships with other people that is not like them. You know, we tend to want to hug up them definition of what life is all about. You know, when one can come show me that these values over the past year, how much years we have been here in Jamaica, these values that has been shown on us, and we have accepted it. We say them value system here don't work for black people for the past 500 years being here. As a matter of fact, because of these value systems, we find say black people is not only worse off, but it is even more cruel in their manifested lifestyle than how they were when they just came here. So there must be something intrinsically wrong with the behavior of black people in a society that is not conducive to their understanding and their way of life. That we have adopted European values to sustain us. And these European values cannot sustain us, it more destroy us. It has been destructive for 500 years, and no one can tell me that it's not going to be destructive for the next 500 years if we continue in this vein. So that is why we need to redefine our understanding of life in its totality. We can't just keep accepting. This is the Cousin Ed and I refer. Yes, brethren.
Yes, Muta.
Long time I don't hear from you, man.
Yeah, we're there, I know.
Yes.
Every night, see you.
I know, man. I know. But I know that sometimes I have to listen.
Yes.
Yes.
You see, a big part of the problem, you know, that you're facing right now is so-called intelligence, you know.
Yes.
People them will take with taxpaying money. And I love interesting, you know, the people see which part this taxation thing start from.
Yes.
You know, and we take our taxpaying money and send what we would call our brightest and our best to university. And then them come back with this European
value system.
Yeah, and it really mess up the whole thing, you know.
Yes. Well, can you imagine now, like even when the man talk about Kenya, when the Europeans go to Kenya, right, them thief the land, you know, them thief the land.
Yeah.
And then now them institutionalize this thing, them taxing.
Yes.
But the Africans, them don't know nothing about money.
Yes.
Because that was not part of them system, money system.
No.
So they institutionalize taxation now, and the taxation must be paid with money, you know.
Yes.
Which the Africans, them don't have.
Yes.
So in order for the Africans, them now get this money, them have to work.
Yes.
So you see the scheme and the connivingness of these people now, who is a vicious cycle you find yourself in. Because you pay now for something that is yours already.
Yeah.
You know? People in Jamaica, you too.
Yeah, and you see, one of the sad things about it, you know, is if even out of the people own self, the people come up with a new way of doing things. This so-called intelligence here now hold back progress.
Yes.
By saying, which part you ever hear this happen before?
Yeah.
It's a question where it hurt me to my gut.
Yeah, you have to find somewhere where it happened before you can really deal with it.
Yeah.
That is why them get stuck in a PNP and GLP.
Precisely.
Because it's the PNP and the GLP maintain the same status quo from 1930 right now, the same Westminster system. Even Siaga the other day declared that he will continue in the Westminster system.
Yeah.
And when we look at England right now, that Westminster system is crumbling.
Yeah, them out for left it.
Yes.
Because it's not working out for them.
So how can we now declare as African people who's coming from a different perception and perspective of life and understanding, maintain this Westminster system that when you put it under the microscope, it's not working in Jamaica? Where is it intelligentsia that is supposed to reevaluate our understanding of life and then form and structure government surrounding this understanding of life? We do have nobody like that doing that.
None, because it's, you know, thank God for Rasta, else we don't know what would have happened to it in this time.
Yeah.
You know? And when you look on it, you know, like I always say, you know, we say now I want them go to Oxford, but the Japanese man send Simon go to Oxford too. And when I want them come back here, them clear them throat deep and that they say, oh, I went to school in Oxford, I'm driving the European car.
Yes.
But when the Japanese man go home, he go to school in Oxford, but he might try a Toyota.
Yeah, my drive a Japanese car, Mitsubishi.
Yeah. And, you know, is a thing. And but a question, when you look at Sierra Leone the other day, and them civil war, we see the chopping off and thing come back.
Yes.
And these things might try to show some little youth. There are a lot of things that we see happening in this time, especially on the continent. It's really a residual thing of
European
white people.
Yes, of course, definitely. The Burundi, the thing in Burundi and Rwanda, it not just happen so. It's residues of the French and the Belgians, them who invade on this a long time and create that disturbance and tribalize the people them to the level of feeling that them is not with each other.
Yeah.
You know, it's not a job. Black people don't get up and start to kill black people.
No.
Don't go so. Even in Jamaica.
Yeah.
Even in Jamaica, these killings is not just random killings.
No.
You know, see it? These things.
Unseen hand.
Yeah, man, it's an see, they have the right metaphor, man. An unseen hand.
Yeah.
It's an unseen hand that is putting that level of thought and wickedness and cruelty in the minds of the youth them so that them could go out there and do these things.
Yeah.
You know, see, no, just happen. It just happen by accident.
Yeah.
You know? So when we look at all African, when we hear guys on radio talk shows that talk about, you know, Africa backward with this and all them now don't reach where Europeans reach and white people is more this. Them don't understand that nobody has ever gone into Europe and stolen Europeans and take them out of Europe and carry them, turn them slave no other way. As a matter of fact, anybody who invade Europe enhance European value system. You know,
yeah, go over there, go show them how to bathe.
And make them stay there.
Come out
you know, see, when Europeans go into other people's country, man, it's devastation, Rasta.
Yeah, and if you look right across the globe, you can point it out. With them go to China, go bad them up for them opium,
gunpowder,
take Hong Kong,
yes,
them.
Yes, use drugs.
Right.
Drugs.
Yeah.
The drugs them do it with, you know.
Right. You go to Australia.
Yes. Aboriginal man them and women. Take them and kill them up. Jack.
Right.
When name Cook.
Yeah.
Cook.
You come to America.
Yes. The Native American them.
right?
The Caribbean. Same thing.
Them they don't even exist anymore.
Yes. And you go in Africa and wipe out the African nation.
Yes.
Everywhere, man. Everywhere, devastation, man. Devastation. So, we understand the mark of the beast.
Yes.
You know, we come out of this Bible talk about mark of the beast is this and this. It's white supremacy is the mark of the beast.
You mentioned about Bible.
Yes.
Because until black people start finding back themselves to the God of them ancestors.
Yes.
We doom.
Yes. And they got the peripheral God. The peripheral God where those upon the edge.
We just come on the scene
Yes.
Because people don't understand that 14th century Africa was a far more developed place than 14th century Europe. You know?
Of course.
Right? And this whole heap of thing where you see Europeans spread out all over the world is really starve. Them did a starve.
Yes.
Right? And then them start drift out now to go look for
food. Yeah, man, the Black Plague.
Yes.
The Black Plague will kill 75% of Europe, man.
Yes.
You know, see it. All them things there. And the need for sugar. You know, there's this drug named sugar. And for 10 years now, nearly 10 years now, we're the consider that tell people why we don't drink sugar, you know.
Yes.
And I see a big headline on the Sunday paper, you know, say, sugar is dirty. Especially in Jamaica, yeah?
Yes.
I can tell you some things where happen on those sugar bags at night time where it's unbelievable.
Yes.
I can tell you things that happen on the sugar bag them filled with sugar.
Yes.
That from my youth, I speak to them, say, watch out, we don't drink sugar, you know. Not because, apart from sugar is not assimilated properly in the body, but me not, hey, you ever see the sugar where they must sell people? The dirty sugar where they must tell people.
Sometimes it has some lumps in there. Where you think them lumps come from?
Hey, you ever mix sugar water, it away your daughter and straight it. You see some things at the bottom of the sugar.
I tell you.
You think out of the key it come from?
Yeah.
As
you mentioned, the Black Plague. Funny is a black woman go save them from the Black Plague.
Yes.
Near a sequel.
Yes. Yeah, this is a continent and RFM. Yeah, man, I tell you. It's a serious thing with this tape, yeah? And would I just glad if the people them who tape it, would I just play it forward and listen to it again, because sometimes that is really why we play the tape them, because them over the night, yeah, sometimes you do assimilate the information properly. But it's like tomorrow, man, you know, in the middle of the day, when you buy yourself or when you don't want to bridge them, and you go to click and press the tape, you realize how much information you did miss and how much information you gather when you re-listen, when you listen to the tape again. You understand? Okay, Cutting Edge RFM.